I'm Dr. Cody Haun. I'm going to share some of my thoughts on monitoring data as it pertains to the training process. And this is from a planned presentation earlier in the day that didn't quite work out, so I wanted to make sure that we were able to get this content out here at the Arnold. It's been a crazy day. We had a mix-up with some of the scheduling, but we're going to go ahead and provide this content. I hope you like it. So I think the first question to answer, and a critical one at that, is why do we even monitor, or why should we monitor? Why not train hard all the time? Why not train to failure and push it every week and hope it all works out? And I think that there are at least 3 good reasons why monitoring makes really good sense. So the first is to prevent injury and overtraining. The second is to maximize the desired training effect, whether that be getting stronger, gaining muscle, losing body fat, improving sport performance. And then the third is to peak at the desired time. For example, like one of our athletes, Jennifer Milliken, who just competed. I think she's actually about to do her final deadlift now. So peaking at meets like this. So monitoring training data can allow us to better manage that entire process, to avoid injury, to maximize the desired training effect, and then to peak at the appropriate time. So first, before I go over some theoretical background here, and I'm going to keep this at about 15 minutes, I'd like to share a story that inspired me to really monitor data and stay on track with what data is being recorded and make sure that it's accurate and use it to our advantage when we start making training decisions as it pertains to our athletes or our clients. One of my graduate school faculty, Dr. Bill Sands, was a physiologist for the United States Olympic Committee, and he shared a story of one of his elite female gymnasts that he was doing a lot of monitoring on. And she presented one day with significantly increased resting heart rate, decreased body weight, and was showing signs of atypical disturbances in her mood. And by atypical, literally a standard deviation or more above her normal observation. And while this seemed discreet but notable, it wasn't so severe that the decision was made to terminate the athlete's training session that day. And so what ended up happening is the gymnast sustained a career-ending injury. And hypothetically, had that constellation of data been weighted a little heavier, perhaps recovery could have been dosed that day and the injury could have been prevented. So that, coupled with my own experience, personal training and being a strength and conditioning coach, I quickly learned early on that objectively deciding what training decision to make next and defending why certain training decisions are made in the first case are 2 additional things that can be afforded to someone that's monitoring training data objectively. So just to sort of give a couple examples from my own life, and it's really inspired me to pursue this academically. But this is just a theoretical or hypothetical representation of the training process. So on the y-axis we have fitness. This could be any fitness attribute that you could really think of. And when we train, we stimulate fatigue. And this fatigue is a consequence of our training that eventually can result in recovery and hopefully adaptation, right? If that fatigue is recoverable. And this adaptation will result in an improvement in fitness, or that's been referred to in the literature as supercompensation. Well, imagine there's this threshold of fatigue that if it accumulates above a certain point, we could call it this injury threshold, or this non-functional overreaching threshold of fatigue. And so if we improperly organize training, and we train before we've effectively recovered, we can move into this non-functionally overreached state or sustain an injury. So the question becomes, how do we avoid this? And so inherently, the training process, like my master's degree mentor, Dr. Stone, used to say all the time, it's a long-term commitment between athlete and coach. And this athlete comes to you with genetics that you can't necessarily change, right? Until CRISPR is within the gym and we can actually go in and edit someone's gene sequence, you're stuck with the athlete's genetics that comes to you. So what do? Well, we can manage other factors related to the training process. Now, this can get quite complex. I'm going to give you quite a few examples here, but just breeze through these because I want to focus on simple, practical application. Now, you can categorize these training loads into, you can categorize loads into training load and what's called life load. And so for training load, we're thinking about things like environmental stress, intensity of training, volume, the duration of training, injury, sleep, different factors that relate to the training load itself. Whereas the life load relates to stress, work, life events, relationship stress. All these factors influence how an athlete will acutely respond to training, and then how an athlete will chronically respond to training. So the interaction of all of these variables are consistently influencing how the athlete will acutely and then chronically respond to training. Now, if these inputs are not managed appropriately, so in the case of insufficient recovery, as in my previous example, we can move into this state of overreaching. And again, if there's this continued insufficiency in recovery, then eventually we can move into this stage of overtraining, or what we would call in the sports science literature as high strain or monotony. And ideally, we want to organize all this. We want to monitor it in way of winning championships, right? Producing the best performances. But I just gave you about 20 different variables that we can monitor, and that's not always practically feasible. So how do we do this? What are some practical examples, and how might APLYFT be able to help with that? Well, so if we sometimes think of what is going on in an athlete or a client's life, it can seem like a black box. We can't follow them around and record everything that they're doing all the time, unless you want to be a weirdo and go to prison. So it's a black box, right, sometimes, and we don't know everything that's happening. So, and forgive the formatting, I had to transfer this to a keynote presentation, but an external load, I'm going to categorize these loads into two categories. You can think of loads as external load variables, or what someone does, and then an internal load variable, or how they respond to it. So that can simplify all those variables that we just discussed, even though they are relevant. Thinking of it this way simplifies it, and these are things that we can actually measure, or at least there are certain variables that I'm going to give you an example of that we can measure. So again, external load, what someone actually does for training, and then internal load, how they respond to it. And what's important is that the internal load actually dictates the adaptive response. The physiological response that is happening as a result of that external load dictates how the athlete will actually acutely and chronically respond. And we can assess these practically. I'm going to give you some examples related to resistance training. So resistance training external load variables can consist of volume load, so that is the total number of reps completed and the absolute load that's lifted relative to the displacement of those loads, so volume load, essentially the total volume of work completed. Training intensity, or the volume load divided by the number of repetitions, sort of a proxy of the average weight lifted. And then session duration, or the total session of the total session time in minutes. Some internal load examples. Average session heart rate would be one. I didn't put things like lactate or more physiological measures on here, but those would fit here as well. Session rating of perceived exertion. So how hard the session was perceived to be by the athlete or the client. And then individual set ratings of perceived exertion, rep left values, or what's been referred to as reps in reserve. This is an internal load variable because it's related to how the athlete perceives they're responding to the work that they're completing. So again, just take a second and pause and think about how can I take practical things that I can monitor and lump those into these two categories, external load variables and internal load variables. Now I'm going to give you, well, and of course all of these things we want to influence to produce the best performances, right? So I'm going to give you a practical example related to resistance training. So if we kind of map out a block of training and monitor external load variables alone, and let's say we run sort of a general, somewhat of a linear progression, and that is we add load, we add volume each week, and in other words, we add sets, we add some reps, and we add some weight. That's a pretty typical progression. So it would look something like this. We progress through a mesocycle of training, and eventually we get to this point where we've really made some improvements. But inevitably, there's a week that doesn't continue to allow this somewhat linear improvement. And that's due to fatigue accumulating throughout a training cycle. And this fatigue masks our fitness. It masks our ability to express our fitness, right? So the coach and the athlete or the client, the individual is left asking, well, what should I do next? If I didn't continue to improve, then what should I do next? Well, so imagine that there's this injury threshold, again, going back to the first couple of figures. And let's say that we decide to accumulate the dose again the following week. And this fatigue value, this cumulative fatigue value, surpasses this injury threshold. And unfortunately, an injury is sustained. This is a reality. This can happen. And so I'm going to show you how monitoring an internal load variable, a very simple one, can actually help prevent this from happening. So I'm just going to give one average session RPE. How difficult was the session on a scale of 1 to 10? So let's say on week 1, the average session RPE was 6. Week 2, the average session RPE was 7. 3, 8.5, and so on until we get to that week that we actually saw a reduction in performance. And that was coupled with this internal load variable that resulted in this 9.5 rating of perceived exertion. So then it can be the decision to deload or reduce the training stress can be based on both of these external and internal load variables, not just one or the other. And by doing so, we can drop cumulative fatigue, and we can therefore avoid injury. So this is analogous to an athlete speeding into a busy intersection and the coach saying, stop, don't do that. And it's kind of humiliating, you know, in the time that you actually have to deload, and sort of humbling. And you're like, why would I do that? I want to keep training. I want to keep going, you know, really hard. But really, the net positive is worth it. You avoid getting hit by a car, or in this case, sustaining an injury. And also, monitoring external load specifically and internal load can help more precisely overload the next cycle of training. In other words, if this micro or this first bar graph to the left here represents the average training stress from the previous cycle, the bars to the right represent how we can very precisely overload training for the first microcycle of the next meso, instead of just arbitrarily deciding to set dose at another 3 sets of 8 at a 6 RPE. We can actually give some pretty precise average weights for those sets, just as an example. And so I'm going to get through these pretty quickly to show you some examples of how the APLYFT workflow can provide some solutions for this and make it more practical for coaches, remote coaches, and clients that are receiving programming online, how this can improve that workflow and that relationship. So this is from a meta-analysis from Peterson et al. In 2004. And this just shows that there are precise or specific intensities of 1 rep max on average throughout the course of a training cycle, and there are exceptions to these, but it's just showing that there are certain intensities of 1 rep max or percentages of 1 rep max that correspond to greater effects on strength. And so it's common practice for coaches and individuals to take their 1 rep max that they've either tested or predicted then calculate a percentage of their 1 rep max to precisely select a load for that session. Well, using software, and this is done in Google Sheets and different things like that often, using APLYFT and different softwares, specifically APLYFT, we can precisely predict the appropriate weight that corresponds to a percentage rather than having to calculate that manually every time. So that's just one example of an advantage that's being worked out in the APLYFT workflow. Excuse the noise. Another example is from myofibrillar protein synthesis rates, and this is just a measurement that's commonly employed in laboratory settings that allows the measurement of the amount of muscle proteins that are being synthesized in response to a specific percentage of 1RM. This is from Portman's in 2016. And what this is showing is we can also be confident that certain percentages of 1 rep max correspond to increases in myofibrillar protein synthesis. And so we want to basically precisely know, or as at least as closely as we can reasonably estimate, what intensity is appropriate to elicit the training response that we want. And again, some of the features of APLYFT can help accomplish this in a little bit more of an efficient manner rather than having to have a calculator and a pen and a pencil each time. And we also know that tapering to elicit an improvement in strength is a good idea, but not just arbitrarily reducing volume and intensity and hoping it works out. In the literature, these are just two examples from Hayden Pritchard in 2015 and Mujica and Padilla in 2003, showing that there are these specific types of tapers. And using somewhat of like a single subject design with a client, different and very precise tapering structures can be attempted to elicit the desired peak that we want. And we can study how different athletes respond to different peak rates or different taper structures, right? So in other words, instead of saying reduce your training stress by 60% and your intensity by 60%, specific reductions in volume and intensity so long as external load variables and those internal load variables are being reasonably monitored, we can actually estimate how athletes specifically respond to certain types of structures. So monitoring external and internal load variables is really important to better understand the specific type of taper that best fits an athlete at a specific time. And then again, as you can see to the right there, Izquierdo has shown and others that tapering is pretty effective for acutely increasing performance capability. In this case, tapering resulted in a significant increase in 1 rep max compared to detraining or a group of control. Now, what about APLYFT? Well, moving out of the beta phases of this, and I've helped to provide some consultations to improve the workflow as an online coach myself, and as an assistant professor and sports science coordinator at LaGrange College, I've tried to take my experience and knowledge and help to create this workflow that is really convenient and efficient for online coaches. And so this is an example. I'm going to skip through some of these, but this is a calendar view where specific training sessions can be programmed either in the AM or the PM. And it's in this really nice user interface. They can be quickly viewed and manipulated from the coach's perspective. And once we click to create a workout, we can select a specific movement and we can create a variation of it. We can program a certain tempo. We can view certain analytics. Obviously, you can select the specific number of sets, reps left, and the weight to use, and then see the athletes or the individual's 1RM there right next to it, and the rest time that you would like to program there on the right, so you can get pretty specific with that external load variable. And these are just showing, okay, once those sessions are programmed, there's this nice user interface on the application that the user can actually pull up and see very easily. So from work portal for the coach to the actual application there on the right that the individual would see. And I must say, this significantly increases the likelihood that clients will actually enter the data that you're requesting. Often, if you use a spreadsheet system, as I've done, and I still have certain spreadsheets for this, often it's common for individuals to not enter all the data you're requesting. So a mobile application can improve the likelihood that that will actually happen. And then here are just some examples of analytics in the portal that I showed an example of previously. So things like body weight progression over time, week-to-week comparisons of body weight, week-to-week comparisons of intensities, and then intensity progressions filtered by date, so that as the coach programs, we can pull up some analytics that we would want to be able to see while we make those training decisions for the subsequent weeks of training. And then cool things like this that really, I think, improve client buy-in and the overall service that you're providing to clients. This monthly performance chart, or just an example of one, where we can quickly report, okay, this is how much your predicted 1RM changed for this lift. These are the volume loads or the workloads that were associated with these movements. These are the percentage changes in these movements. And being able to see that and appreciate the change over time can improve an athlete's buy-in and really improve the defense of why certain training decisions are made or not made. And again, these are just other examples of showing how certain percentages of 1RMs can be calculated. And these are constantly being developed. Some of these are being developed right now. They're not all done. But these are just things that we're hoping to include that improve the quality of the experience for both the coach and the athlete. So again, I'm an assistant professor and I'm a sports science coordinator at LaGrange College. We offer a master's degree in strength and conditioning online. And if you're interested in anything related to the topics that I discussed today, I'd be happy to receive an email from you. My email is chaun, CHAUN, at LaGrange, that's LAGRANGE.edu. And if you're here at the Arnold, visit us at booth 2329 and come talk to us, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Hope you enjoyed the talk and have a great day.